Okay. So we will start with the cardiac cycle. Now, to understand the cardiac cycle, there are two terms that are very, very important, and we need to understand these two terms. The first one is systole. Systole is a fancy term for contraction, and the second term is diastole, and that's a fancy term for relaxation. So, when we say the heart is contracting, we can say it's in systole. Or if you want to say the heart is in relaxed state, we can say that the heart is in diastole. So systole, contraction, diastole, relaxation. Now, cardiac cycle is defined as the mechanical events of the heart during one heartbeat. Okay, so we are looking into one heartbeat, and we will see how the blood flows from one chamber to the other. So we will essentially look at the mechanical events during one heartbeat. Okay, now for this slide, I have represented the heart by the green boxes. How many green, not boxes, squares. How many green squares do you see? 5, right? Each green square represents the heart. And if you look at each heart, it is subdivided into 4 chambers. So each green square has 4 smaller green squares, right? So this is our heart here. Now, first we will start with the hand-drawn diagram on the left hand side, and then we will move all the way to the right hand side. Okay. Now let's look on the top right side. There is a yellow box. Do you see that? Now let's look into the yellow box. The yellow box has 2 yellow lines, little 2 yellow dash lines, and those are the AV valves, or the atrioventricular valves. Essentially, those are representing the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves. Then we also see 2 orange dots, and those orange dots represent the semilunar valves, the pulmonary semilunar and the aortic semilunar valves. So the point is, whenever you see the yellow lines, know that I'm talking about the AV valves, or the bi and the tricuspid valves. And when you see the orange dots, know that I'm talking about the pulmonary and the aortic semilunar valves. Good? Okay, now let's move to the very left side of the slide, and let's look at the heart. So the green box represents the heart, and the blue lines, do you see the blue vessels? These 2? Okay, these are just blood vessels. Okay, so the first part that we will talk about is called late diastole or atrial relaxation. And by late diastole, we are looking into the functions of the ventricles here. Okay, what do we mean by diastole? Yes, relaxation. So at this point, listen to me. At this point, the ventricles, the 2 ventricles are relaxed, and also the atria are relaxed. So there is no contraction anywhere. The atria are not contracting, the ventricles are not contracting. Both the atria and the ventricles are in very, very relaxed state. And the bicuspid and the tricuspid valves are open, and blood is flowing from the atria into the ventricles passively. There is passive flow of blood from high to low via the AV valves. So what's happening here? Let's write it down. So in this case, the atria relaxed, ventricles relaxed, AV valves, or the bi and tri, they are open, right? And blood is flowing passively, from the atria into the ventricles. Are we good? What is what are the semilunar valves doing? Well, in this case, the semilunar valves are closed. Semilunar valves are closed, as you see here. Okay. Now, I want you to know one thing. 70% of the blood flows from the atria into the ventricles during late diastole, where both the atria and the ventricles are relaxing. So 70% of blood flows passively from the upper two chambers to the lower two chambers by atrial relaxation and ventricular filling. Next, now 70% of the blood has already moved into the ventricles, right? We have only very, very little blood left in the atria at this point. Okay, what will happen now? Now the atria will contract and squeeze the remaining blood into the ventricle. So we have 30% left. Actually, not here. We have 30% left in the atria. And this 30% blood that is left in the atria will be squeezed out into the ventricles. And so that's why the atria will undergo systole, and this phase is called atrial systole, when the atria contracts, pushing blood into the ventricle. This is also known as atrial contraction and ventricular filling. During this time, the AV valves, the bi and the tricuspid valves are open, and the semilunar valves, the aortic and the pulmonary semilunar valves are closed. Good. Moving on, what's happening next? So right now the ventricles are filled with blood. Too much blood in the ventricles, right? A lot of pressure in the ventricle. The atria has squeezed out all the blood at this point. Now the ventricles will start contracting. And this is called isovolumetric contraction. This is called what? Isovolumetric contraction of the ventricles. Now the ventricles will just start to contract. It has not contracted to its full capacity. So it's just starting to contract. And when it just starts to contract, what happens to the AV valves and what happens to the semilunar valves? Well, the AV valves are closed. And if you look at the semilunar valves, they are also closed. So the AV valves and the semilunar valves both are closed during isovolumetric contraction. All right. Now the ventricles have just started to contract, right? Then obviously the contraction will increase and the ventricle will contract more. As the ventricular contraction increases, that helps to push out blood from the ventricle, a process called ventricular ejection. So by ventricular ejection, blood is pumped out of the ventricles into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. And during ventricular ejection, of course, blood flows out of the ventricle. And during this time, the AV valves are closed and the semilunar valves open, as you see here. So the AV valves are closed and the semilunar valves are open. Good. Now, the ventricles have squeezed out all the blood by contraction, right? Now, the ventricles are tired. So the ventricles will be like, oh my God, I worked so hard, I need to rest. So now the ventricle will relax, and this is called isovolumetric relaxation. During this phase, the blood has already moved out of the ventricles. So the ventricles are in relaxed state. Okay. And at this point, the AV valves are closed and the semilunar valves are also closed. Looks like delicious lecture exam question. Alright, so let's review this one more time real quick. So we are looking at cardiac cycle, which refers to the mechanical events of the heart during one heartbeat. We will start with the green boxes or the green squares represent human heart with 4 chambers. We will start with the top left side, and at the top left we see a human heart with 4 chambers, and this state is called the late diastole. Diastole, as we know, refers to relaxation. So in this case, both the atria and the ventricles are in relaxed state, and blood from the atria is flowing passively into the ventricles from high pressure to low pressure. So blood is moving from the atria to the ventricles by the AV valves. The AV valves are open. The bi and the tricuspids are open. However, the semilunar valves are closed. And during this phase, which is late diastole, 70% of the ventricles are filled in this process. Next, we see that the ventricles are 70% filled with blood, and there is 30% blood remaining in the atria. So the atria will now squeeze and will undergo contraction called atrial systole, and it will squeeze out the remaining blood into the ventricle. This is also called atrial contraction and ventricular filling, meaning the atria is contracting or in systole to fill the ventricles. At this stage, the AV valves are open and the semilunar valves are closed. The next phase, is in the next phase, we see that the ventricles are filled with blood and the ventricles will just start contracting. And as the ventricles just start to contract, this is called isovolumetric contraction of the ventricle. Now, since the ventricles are starting to contract, both the AV valves and the semilunar valves are closed at this point. Next, the ventricles have contracted, so they are in full contraction mode. And when the ventricles are in full contraction mode, obviously the AV valves are closed to prevent backflow into the atria. But the semilunar valves open to lead the blood into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So the semilunar valves are open, pushing blood into blood vessels, and blood flows out of the ventricle. Okay, now after the ventricular ejection, this is also called ventricular ejection, and after the ventricular contraction or ventricular systole, the ventricles are too tired, so it will undergo relaxation. This is called isovolumetric relaxation, and at this time, both the AV valves and the semilunar valves are closed. Okay, they are closed, and that marks the end of the cardiac cycle. So on your exam, I can ask you, during late diastole, which valves are open, which valves are closed? In which direction is blood flowing? I can ask you, in atrial systole, which valves are open, which are closed, which way is blood flowing? So questions like this, you have to know at each of the steps. So we talked about 5 different steps, right? At each step, which valve is open, which valve is closed, and blood is flowing from where to where. Sounds like delicious lecture exam question. I'll stop here and then start with the